Welcome to Scoring Opportunity, the only Bundesliga Fantasy Manager podcast featuring jazz. I am, as always, your host Fred, aka Time to Notbremse. Well, another manager bites the dust. This time it's Jesse Marsch of Leipzig. Other manager seats are wobbly. I'm looking at you, Hutter and Glasner. This will definitely be an interesting December. Not to pat my own shoulder, especially because I didn't follow my own advice, but some of the picks I mentioned on last week's episode did really well, and I should have gone with differentials Holtmann, Wimmer, or Diaby instead of going for safer picks, and I lost out on a lot of points. Now that I'm entrenched in the top 500, I need to go with riskier picks in order to gain ground against the elite of the elite. On today's show, we'll do a review of Matchday 14, looking at the top point scorers of the Matchday, as well as giving my thoughts while watching the highlights. Then I'll go over the matches for this coming Matchday and highlight some key players. Following that, I'll go over my top 5 differentials for the coming weeks and top 3 punts for this Matchday, and end, of course, with your listener questions. Let's get cracking! Moving on to the review of Matchday 14, and we'll start again with the heroes of the Matchday, the top fantasy point scorers, to discuss their overall value in the game. First up, by a wide margin, was Partrick Schick with 31 points. He scored 4 in Leverkusen's 7-1 win over Fürth, and as I mentioned last week, the Leverkusen front four of Schick, Diaby, Wirtz, and Adli look beastly. Schick is now easily on par with Müller as the best third striker option next to Lewandowski and Haaland. Next up is Gerrit Holtmann of Bochum. Last week I recommended Holtmann as a punt because of the fixture against Augsburg and the fact that a lot of Augsburg attacking plays come from crosses from their fullbacks. Holtmann was able to find the spaces in the final third and contributed with a goal and an assist, and Bochum showing us some fine football. Holtmann's teammate Polter netted 19 points, but as a striker he's less interesting to me as there are many better options out there. I feel there's no need to go outside of a premium striker option at the moment, but even if you do, there are better mid-priced options than Polter like Awoniyi, Burkhardt, and Höhler. 20 points were also scored by Freiburg's Nico Schlotterbeck. He scored a goal in Freiburg's 6-0 defeat of Gladbach, but also contributed shots on goal and of course won duels points. At 8.8 million ducats, Schlotterbeck should be on everyone's radar, especially now that Freiburg has ended their losing run. Lewandowski is up next with 19 points, but there isn't much to say there, just get him in your team if you don't have him in already. The second Leverkusen player on the list is Amin Adli with 18 points. In fact, let's just quickly go over the totals of their front four. Schick 31 points, Adli 18 points, Wirtz 16, and Diaby 12 points. That's 77 points from 4 players. If all of them stay healthy and play at the same time, Leverkusen will continue their run from earlier in the season. I think they can compensate one of these for if injured, but we saw how Leverkusen struggled offensively when both Schick and Diaby were out. Timo Baumgartel of Union is next on the list with 18 points. He's a decent pick at 5.9 million ducats, but of course his goal inflated his score this week. He's averaging just 5 points per match. Another central defender with a goal this week was Philipp Lienhardt of Freiburg. He's averaging 7 points per match, so he's a better pick than Baumgartel long term. Lienhardt is basically the budget Schlotterbeck. The best Dortmund player fantasy points wise in the Klassiker was Jude Bellingham. His 16 points topped his team's table by 6 points. Bellingham is a good pick, joining other premium priced midfielders like Wirtz, Grifo, Nkunku, Hofmann, and Kostic. Brandt is averaging the same amount of points per match, 8, as Bellingham, and is a more differential pick. Steven Jovetic of Hertha scored a brace as well as 16 fantasy points last weekend. He's too pricey for me to be a candidate for my team, as Hertha still has to convince me to pick any of their players by winning some matches. Their squad does not excite me at all. Grifo and Caligiuri both scored 15 points, with Grifo contributing 2 assists and Caligiuri an assist and a penalty goal. Grifo is of course a better option as Freiburg are deservedly 4th in the Bundesliga. Other mentions are Kostic with 14 points, Freiburg's youngster Schade who also scored 14 points and is listed as a forward but only costs 1.2 million ducats. Burkhardt and Marmouche are also honorable mentions with a goal each and 13 fantasy points to their names last weekend. Moving on to the eye test, and I won't be going through all matches chronologically, but will give my thoughts on some players or teams I will be keeping my eye on. First up, I wanted to mention how crap Dortmund's defense looked. The goals they conceded were of their own making, so don't expect much points-wise from their central defenders. All these goals are also impacting Guerreiro's value too. At 14.3 million ducats, he's a high-priced option, and if he doesn't deliver attacking returns, he isn't actually that valuable. On the other hand, Bayern is somewhat in a similar predicament, but Davies is currently a much better option than Guerreiro, despite costing 0.6 million ducats more. You will be able to get more out of Bayern's central defenders, as Bayern essentially defend by attacking. Players to highlight while watching the highlights were Partrick, who scored an impressive 12 fantasy points, and Hertha's Belfodil, who propped up Hertha's attack with his high level of activity inside the opposition penalty box. Alright, let's move on to Matchday 15 and a look at the matches and the key players. This week's Friday night match features Köln at home against Augsburg. Augsburg have been on the up despite the 3-2 loss to Bochum, and we could see them put up a good fight with counterattacks from the likes of Vargas, Hahn, and their fullbacks Iago and Pedersen if he plays. Of course, Caligiuri is the playmaker in Augsburg's midfield. For Köln, I think Modest will be pushing to get back onto the scoresheet after 3 goalless matches. Schmitz and Özcan should do a job again. Both players are viable budget options, especially for a Friday night fixture. If Ut is still out, Duda could start up top again with Modest, but Duda is really a one-week punt at this point. I do not trust him with scoring goals. Moving on to the Saturday fixtures, and there we have Leipzig against Gladbach, 2 teams under pressure to perform. This will be an interesting one. And if you haven't seen the news yet, it looks like Domenico Tedesco will be taking over in Leipzig. Yes, it's that Domenico Tedesco who took Schalke to a second place in the Bundesliga, then got sacked the next season after a winless streak. Tedesco is known to favor a 3-4-1-2 system, essentially what Leipzig have been playing, but I assume he'll be favoring other players than Marsch did. However, no Leipzig manager will go without Nkunku, who has been Leipzig's standout player so far this season. Hofmann is Gladbach's equivalent. I wouldn't recommend any other players at the moment because we really don't know how Tedesco's team will look like, and on the other side, how Hütter will change things after 2 brutal defeats in a row. I am looking forward to seeing if Angelino improves his fantasy value under Tedesco. The next match we're looking at is Freiburg taking on Hoffenheim. Freiburg ended their 3-game winless streak with that impressive 6-0 over Gladbach, but Hoffenheim is also in good form, scoring 9 goals in their last 2 matches. We could be looking at 5 to 6 goals in that match, and it could go either way. Players to look at are definitely Grifo and Hurler from Freiburg, and definitely Rutter and Bebu from Hoffenheim. Günther has snapped his fantasy point cold streak, as did Schlotterbeck, and although I don't expect a Freiburg clean sheet this weekend because of Hoffenheim's good goal-scoring form, I do expect more attacking returns from the Freiburg defense, especially the wingbacks Günther and Kübler. Hoffenheim midfielders Geiger and Raum are becoming interesting options too, as both have hauled twice in the past 3 weeks. By that I mean scored at least 10 fantasy points in a match. Jung, of course, is still good value in midfield at 5.1 million ducats, but his fantasy form has been lacking in the last weeks. Bielefeld away at Hertha is the next match on Saturday afternoon. I do not expect a fantasy points fireworks in this match. Players to highlight here are Partrick Wimmer, Fabian Klos, Alessandro Schöpf of Bielefeld, and Jovetic, Serdar, and Richter of Hertha. A 1-week punt may be worth taking on a cheap defender from either side, like Laursen, if you need to free up funds. The other revered derby is up next with Bochum hosting Dortmund. Haaland should be back to his old self and should be transferred in by anyone who can afford him. If you can't, Royce is a solid alternative. Brandt looked great against Bayern, and if he does play, despite that knockout he suffered, he could be a nice differential. Bellingham is also in my thoughts, as he was a strong contributor in their Klassiker last weekend. On the Bochum side, Riemann should be back in goal, and Polter and Holtmann look like good mid-priced options, or in the case of Holtmann, a budget midfielder. Guerrero is back as well, but like I said earlier, his value could suffer if Dortmund continue to invite goals with their meek defending. The last match of Saturday afternoon is Bayern at home to Mainz. I can see Mainz causing an upset, or at least making it very difficult for Bayern. However, I can also see another comfortable Bayern win. Don't bring in Mainz assets this week, and if you already have some, be prepared for meager returns. Any Bayern forward is of course a good option, but the only other player outside the forward line I'd recommend at the moment is Davies, maybe Goretzka. The Saturday evening match sees Wolfsburg hosting Stuttgart, and this match may also see 5 to 6 goals between the two teams. Neither side has been defensively solid, but both are able and willing to score, especially after disappointing results last weekend. From Wolfsburg, I recommend Weghorst or Nemecha, from Stuttgart, Karazor or Marmouche. However, neither team has returned much in the way of fantasy value in the last few weeks. This is not really an investable match. Moving on to the Sunday matches, and first up is Fürth hosting Union. Here, any pick from the Union squad should be a good option. Awoniyi, Gieselmann, and Trimmel are my recommendations there. Fürth players are out of the question, as they will only provide fantasy value if they score, and Union's defense shouldn't need to let that happen. The last match of the weekend is Leverkusen away at Frankfurt. Kostic is of course the standout fantasy option from the Frankfurt side. I do foresee a Leverkusen win, however, so I wouldn't invest in any other Frankfurt player, besides a cheap one-week punt like Lindstrom or Chandler. Any of Leverkusen's front four are of course good options, compounded by the fact that it's a standalone fixture. Frimpong is another good option, as he provides good value as the right-sided fullback and gets high up the pitch on many occasions. Now on to my top 5 recommended differentials, and we start off with Dominik Szoboszlai. He's usually dangerous and should continue being the second best Leipzig point scorer, even under new manager Tedesco. Plus, Leipzig have a good run of fixtures, which should give Tedesco a good chance of settling in and implementing his style of play even before the winter break. And he will definitely not go without Szoboszlai. Number 4 on the differential list is Lucas Höhler. He continues to be a great mid-price striker option and will get you points regardless of the score. Number 3 is Marco Reus. Like I mentioned earlier, if you can't afford to get in Haaland, Reus is a good alternative in Dortmund's attack. Reus is averaging 10 points per match at 15.5 million ducats, which is better than Kramaric, Weghorst, or Gnabry. Number 2 on the list is Georgina Rutter. He's continuing his fine form, and despite some tough fixtures for Hoffenheim, I can see him returning points at his current pace of 9.4 points per match in his last 5 matches. The top differential recommendation this week is Amin Adli of Leverkusen. Of the Leverkusen front four, he's the most differential pick with an average of 8.8 points in his last 5 matches, while costing only 8.3 million ducats. Here are my top 3 punts for this weekend as well. The 3 spot goes to Breel Embolo. He only has 1 substitute appearance in those last 2 Gladbach defeats, and it looks as though he's poised to start against Leipzig, and is trusted more than Plea, who has been disappointing in the past weeks. Long-range goal specialist Pantovic looks like he's getting a start because Leuven is now in corona quarantine. Pantovic costs only 3.5 million ducats, and although Bochum play Dortmund, Pantovic could net a good return for his price tag. My top 1-week punt recommendation is Mikhail Grigoric. He has scored coming off the bench in each of the last 2 matches for Augsburg and is getting a start ahead of Zakiri, who took a knock last weekend. On to your listener questions, and the first one is from Benjamin Tonelli, who has 2 questions. The first asks for a plan to choose from the following: A. Keep Schick, B. Sell Schick, buy Modeste, or C. Sell Schick, buy Awoniyi. I would go with A. Keep Schick, unless you have a transfer for which you need the extra funds, say upgrading in midfield. Then I'd go with C. Buying Awoniyi and targeting that Fürth fixture. But Schick is in fine form and should get a good return again. The second question is which defender to sell this week, Akpoguma or Scally. Scally has been in atrocious fantasy form, netting a grand total of -5 points over the last 2 weeks. But his price tag of now 2.5 million ducats is still just too good for a player still averaging 6 points per match. In this case, I would sell Akpoguma. Benjamin also adds, "Thanks in advance for the answers and keep up the great content." Ben, I really appreciate your kind words. I hope my answers help you this week. The second question comes from Chris Veliker, who asks, "Do you think it might be time to drop Gladbach players because of team form and focus on premium assets from teams like Leipzig and Dortmund, who also have better fixtures?" Thanks for this question, Chris. Any other Gladbach players besides Hofmann and Scally I would sell, unless you're going with 1 week punt, recommendation, and Bolo, because none have shown to be reliable fantasy assets this season. As for the second part of your question, there are more premium assets from Dortmund to pick from than from Leipzig. I already answered the Leipzig part of the question, so here are my picks from Dortmund in order of importance: Haaland, Royce, Brandt when fit, Guerrero, Bellingham. One last one from both Trevor and FBL Thinker, awesome contributors within the Bundesliga Fantasy Manager community, who ask, "Keep Schick or transfer him out for Haaland or Awoniyi?" Thanks guys for the question. I'm adding this one even though it's similar to Ben Tonelli's question from before, with the addition of the Haaland part. As I said before, Haaland is essential. If you can afford to get him in without significantly weakening your squad, you should make that transfer. So the question isn't Schick or Haaland, but can you afford Schick and Haaland? A good amount of players will have a premium-only midfield, so that may be the part of your squad to look to cheapen price-wise. Or alternatively, go with super cheap defense options like Gieselman, Scally, Kubler, Schmitz, Karazor, Hack, Martin, or Laursen. That was our show for this week. Remember to get your team set by 2025 Central European Standard Time on Friday. Also, the Bundesliga is going into a so-called English week with midweek fixtures on Tuesday and Wednesday. I will try to put out a short episode on Monday or Tuesday with a longer episode next Thursday, covering match days 15 and 16 if need be. Until then, may your picks fire on all cylinders and your ranks rise like an Olympic rock climber. Let's all have a great match day.